So we're about ready to begin our snow painting. And in this snow scene, it's not going to be a sunny day. It will be a snowing day. We're going to keep it somewhat simple, at least attempt to. I have drawn out a picture of a tree and it will be in the snow. So we're also going to use a limited palette. We were talking analogous color palette would be at least 3 colors next to one another on the color wheel, such as blue, blue, green, and green, blue, violet, blue, and blue, green. Any 3 colors that are related to one another on the color wheel. If you go into Canvas, I have more information on this. And in Canvas, I mentioned how Monet would sometimes have, say, 4 colors related to one another on the color wheel, and then throw a complementary color in where the focal point was at the end of the painting. And he would just use a tiny bit of the complement, but it was enough to sort of like set all the colors, just make them all come alive with the contrast. I've made up some color swatches. We're going to look at these. So here I have, we're going to use a phthalo green, a phthalo blue. No, I'm not going to use a phthalo blue. I'll tell you why. I am going to use a little bit of phthalo green because in watercolor, there's not a lot of great greens. You all have the intense Cotman green, which is basically phthalo green. You have phthalo green by Da Vinci, and you have a Viridian green, and you have a cobalt turquoise light by Winsor Newton. Your phthalo green and your Viridian both, you can mix most of your greens that you'll ever need out of one of those 2 greens. These 2 colors are very similar in their appearance on the palette, but this one is a transparent, non-staining, non-granular green, whereas this one is highly intense, highly staining, and and you're going to get darker values out of this one since it stains the color of the paper, and this one does not. So staining colors are going to give you your darker values, but they stain the color of the paper. So if you mix, you can mix your phthalo green to cut down on the intensity. We'll use a little bit of burnt sienna. We're going to use the burnt sienna not as a color, but we're going to use it to gray today. So, and it will still be within a monochromatic scale. So if we look at the swatches I did, some of them are still a little wet. This one was a phthalo blue with a little burnt sienna. And here are some of the variations I have, which are, there are some grays in there, but they're going to go darker. And then this is an indigo that has a little bit of phthalo green in it and burnt sienna, and it's much darker in value. And we're using the indigo by Daniel Smith. Daniel Smith, I find that most manufacturers will have their own version of an indigo. And Daniel Smith's indigo looks almost blackish when you first put it down. I really like Winsor Newton's the best. It has more, it's a little more bluish. Here's a cobalt blue by itself, and then mixed with some phthalo green, with a little ultramarine blue, and burnt sienna mixed in there. I'm going to come back and I'll comment on all these afterwards. This one is French ultramarine with some burnt sienna, tiny bit of phthalo green in there. This is lunar black by itself. Lunar black mixed with your French ultramarine, a little bit of phthalo green. I don't think I mixed it. No burnt sienna on that one. This one right here is my favorite. It has the phthalo green with burnt sienna mixed here, French ultramarine there, and here's the phthalo green, or mostly French ultramarine and burnt sienna. Look at those beautiful, nice grays you can get out of this. And French ultramarine blue is a very granular color. So we want to have the effect that it's snowing, and we're going to use salt to create our snow. So while the painting is drying, but before all the gloss is gone, we'll drop some salt in it to create that snow effect. And that will work beautiful with the granular color. Now, if we want a little lighter value, this is cobalt blue with the burnt sienna. So this is what we're going to stick to. I think it works best for the snowing scene, and I'll tell you why in just a moment. Here's phthalo green, again, phthalo green with burnt sienna and French ultramarine. Now, if you notice, the phthalo blue and the phthalo green, the indigo, these colors here are all darker in value. So they're giving a darker value range. And really for a snowing scene, I think it's going to be too strong a contrast. And yet there's still an intensity with the phthalo blue and the phthalo green. So it would take using more of the burnt sienna to cut down on the intensity, since it's a near complement to those colors. Now, oh, there's a hair in here. Over here, we had, man, that's not working for me. I don't care for this one so much. And then this particular one right here, the cobalt blue, French ultramarine, burnt sienna, phthalo green, this looks like a sunny day. So this would be great if the sun's come out and we're not trying to create snow. It would work wonderful for that palette, but for a snowy day, that's not what we want. So we're going to stick more in this color range right here. So this one, that's phthalo green, very little phthalo green, burnt sienna, French ultramarine blue, and on occasion where we want lower contrast, less granulation, like it may be snowdrifts at the foot of the tree, we'll use cobalt blue with burnt sienna. Okay, so next I want to show you the drawing I have. Let's see if you can see this pretty good. So here's my drawing. I drew out an oak tree. And the top of the tree is missing. There'll be some snow in the tree. There's a snowdrift at the bottom. And you have to be careful on these papers because we're just using the student grade paper, nothing fancy right now. But by the time I finish drawing it out, I see an awful lot of graphite still on the paper. And preferably when I'm doing a painting, I don't want to be doing a lot of erasing because it can really disturb the fibers of the paper and the way that the paint receives the paint on the paper. And so you don't want to have that messing up. Now, I did use a water-soluble pencil in some areas. And I drew much darker than I would for my paintings because otherwise you're not going to see my drawing ahead of time. And for the demo, you need to see my drawing. So I'm still doing a little bit of erasing in here. Again, try to do the least amount of erasing as possible. And you really don't even need to have a tree this complicated. So maybe if we have an opportunity, I'll show you more than one. Next, what I'm going to do is I just want to show you a couple of more techniques of painting the snow. So let's get some paper down here. And we will, let's see, trying to get set up where you can see, and I've got my supplies in order. So I am, you always want to be practical when you're painting. Don't have if you're right-handed, don't put your water and your palette on your left side. You keep it on your right side, right? That way you're not going to be dropping on your painting. I'm going to put my swatch right smack in front of me. And here's the little paint palette. I can use the paint from the paint palette that each one of you have. So I'm going to take some French ultramarine and I will put it on the plate here. And let me mix plenty of this up because this will be more or less the main color. Now I'll mix some burnt sienna into it. You can use your palette, you can use a plate. And let's see, we'll even put down a swatch of that here. See how gray that is? Now, if it has, right now I say it has a little more of the reds and I want a little more blue. So I'm going to put a little more blue into this so that I keep the temperature very cool. More blue. Blue is my favorite color. Okay, so here's more blue. And of course, this is going to vary depending on what else I put into it, but this is going to give me just a gray tone, which you're going to need a gray tone. And at times we'll have more blue in it, and other times we won't. But let's just do a few little, just mixing a little bit of creating a effect of snow. So I'm going to take the 1-inch flat brush I have, and I'm just going to paint a little area just so you can see the technique. Now, I just worked wet on dry. Okay, we're going to do a wet on wet. We'll do a wet on dry. So maybe I want some more blue in there. If I do, I can come in here and I can drop more blue in. But see, that would be too intense for a snowy day. So again, I would need to come over here and mix more blue burnt sienna, because the burnt sienna will cut down on the intensity and make it more of a grayish tone. Now, if I want to stick some phthalo in there, I can do that as well. But I also, when mixing the phthalo, here I'll do a sample of that one by itself. When I mix the phthalo green by itself, it's going to be way too intense. So now I'm going to put some burnt sienna in it, and I've cut down on the intensity, but I've also made it, it's more, less blue-green as well. So if I need it to go back toward a blue-green, I can just stick a little bit more French ultramarine in there too. Okay, depending on where I want to go with it. So if I have a tree in the background, I can, that's what wet on dry is going to do. So you have to work pretty fast. Now, it's almost too late for salt on this one. I'll give you an idea of what to expect. So, right now, the salt is only going to go where the wet paint is, because the rest of it, being I worked wet on dry, this is where the tree area was, is pretty much the only wet area left. So now we're going to do a wet on wet. So let's take water. We're going to put it over the whole area here. And believe it or not, for snow, you really don't need a lot of white if it's snowing out. You really don't have to have much white of the paper, if any. So now I can go in here and I can paint, adding blue. If I want to add some green in there to give the illusion of trees in the background, I can go ahead and do that. And remember, it's snowing, so the visibility may not be very good. So I'm now giving that just almost a ghost of an illusion back there that there is, that it's, the visibility is poor. See, if you can see the palette as I'm mixing, this is way too intense for a day that is snowing. So I have to put something in that to gray that color, and I am using the burnt sienna. So now I can come in here if I want more contrast. I need more pigment than what I had. Come in here. You don't have to do a whole lot to it. Now, this is still damp, and it needs to set up. But as it sets up, I can drop salt into that. You just want to make sure that salt is going down. That's a lot of salt. You want to put that salt down before it dries. So if you look, if you can see this well, you'll notice that, and I'm using table salt here. There's different kinds of salts you can use to get different effects, but if you're working a small painting, the table salt will probably be just fine. Whereas if you're using like a rock salt that is big crystal, the crystals might be just a little too big for a small painting. But the salt will start to absorb the water and some of the paint. So right now where the salt is, you'll notice it gets dark. So that would be for my areas of the background and even part of the foreground where I want to have that more or less kind of a snowy effect. So don't feel like you have to copy exactly what I'm doing in a painting, okay? You have liberty to do what you want with this. When this dries, I'm going to show you how we can paint something over this to get a similar type of effect of contrast that we're doing with the bigger painting here, if that's a direction you prefer to go in. So this is going to take a few minutes to dry. As I said, when I am drawing for demonstration, I'm usually going much, much darker in my drawing. And one line I really prefer to get rid of is the one right here at the back of where the forest is going to be separate from that foreground. And I actually experimented with my pencils this time. I used a graphite pencil that's water soluble. I wanted to see how it would have an effect on this piece. So I need to take a bigger brush. Oh, rats. I wish I pulled out a bigger brush. So this is going to have to do. Now, I could go in and white out some of the snow, but I don't like using whiteout. I really can't stand it. So instead, what I'm going to do is I'm going to come in here and I'm going to wet some of these areas in between. I'll start with them. And I'm just going to paint around the areas that are in between the branches and save any white that I might want to save. Okay. I'm going to put a little clear water in this. Not super, super wet up there. Sure I don't lose the shape of the tree. Trees are challenging. Really practice drawing and observing, and because you'll find that just to go out and draw a good tree is important since it's used in so many paintings. And you want to be able to make sure you can draw it where it looks believable, that the tree has volume to it, that it isn't just going up and down and left and right, but that it actually has volume. So I'm dropping a little more pigment in some areas as well. But the tree itself is going to have, I don't want to go too dark on the background because the background is has to be lighter than the tree will be. In some of these little spaces, I'm not adding water first, as you can see. Make sure you mix enough paint in your palette or on your plate, whichever you're using, ahead of time so you don't have to keep trying to match it up. I'm going to drop a little more green in some of these too. The muted green, of course. Because they don't all have to be the same color. I wanted to have like there's a forest effect behind this tree and the way off in the distance. I'm going to bring this down here. And some of the branches I will not paint around because there's going to be some smaller branches that can be painted on top of the snow area afterward, being that they're darker. Okay. Notice how I brought, where this one's a little more greenish, I brought some of that green a little bit more here and into there. So it all relates. So even if they don't, they're not, I don't even want them all to look like the same exact color. Okay. But you don't want to have the values be changed too much because then that will not work for you. That will throw it off. Trying to understand them on my drawing here too. Like I said, I'm going to cover some of these branches up. I can paint over them afterward. And even the little bit of snow, if there's a little bit of snow back there, I can retrieve a little bit of that. Instead of putting white out down, I'm just going to use a razor blade and I can scratch some of that out. Okay, stick a little more blue in there. A little bit more of that up here. I'm going to drop a little bit of salt into these bigger areas here. So, real simple palette today. Okay. Let's get a better point up here. Make sure my drawing is still working for me. I'm not crazy about that branch up there, so I'll have to do something about that later. Okay. Let's come over here. Now I'm working more wet on dry, if you notice. So let's get that paper a bit more wet because I do want to add the salt, and the salt won't take well to dry paper. It won't do much of anything unless there's water on that paper. Almost dry there. Okay, grab some more salt. If you just take a little bag with you with table salt or rock salt or both, you can put it in your supply bag when you come to class. You'll have it already. Very little salt. That dried differently there. Okay. Paper wet now. I can see how the water-soluble graphite is adding a gray tone to this, which I'm okay with because I'm working with a lot of grays anyway. Okay. Let's see. Take this. Clear water. Okay, now we're going to start dropping some more paint in there. Give the illusion of a snowstorm. Remember, it dries what? Lighter or darker? Dries lighter. So always bear that in mind. This looks like a big old fir tree back there. Okay. Now, if I want to drop in some more color, like I'm going to mix some more French ultramarine with the burnt sienna, gray that up. I can get some more shadows going in that snow. And I also want it to relate to these colors up here so I don't have a total mismatch. So I need to work on that. The yellow green, burnt sienna, French ultramarine, and burnt sienna. Yeah, I'm going to put a fence line up here. Looks like a fence back there. Like I said, I don't want too much color, but I do need to make sure. I probably should drop a little more blue in because some of these areas have more blue. So I just want to make sure that they're relating color-wise without going too blue. Okay. These colors mix. Drop some salt. Now, when the painting is completely done and dry, we can wipe the salt off. Now, if I work fast enough, ooh, let me go back over here. Look how this dried real pretty. See, that was the wet on wet where I dropped the salt in, and look at the pretty effect it gives. It creates a snow-like effect. It's beautiful, isn't it? Works much better than, say, the wet on dry where it was, this dry was already too dry. And where that was wet is the only area that the snow effect came through with the salt. So now I need to work fast here. In fact, I might save this part for afterwards. Where I'm more concerned is matching this up right now. So first we're going to put clear water down. You really have to gauge as well the, if you have a heater blowing, or like in the classroom, the heater, the room's usually pretty warm, your paper will dry faster. So if you have a real dry climate versus a more humid climate. If you were working outdoors and it is a humid day, your paper is going to dry real slow. Let's let this mix. Don't you love it how the colors, when they mix on their own, how pretty they are? They're just so fresh. The less you fuss with it. It's already setting up in here. Need to go a little darker up to that tree there. Okay. Okay, so make sure this gets fairly evenly saturated with water as well. Remember, you want your paper to dry even so you don't get backwashes. And I'm also going to come over here. Maybe too wet over here right now to do much. You don't need much salt. That'll be pretty. Gonna drop a little more green. There. Okay, oh, that's looking pretty. So far, so good. Okay, so again, now I have it upside down for you to look at. I will need to go darker as I come up, but notice how it's gradating as it comes over. So you just want to make sure. Ooh, that's interesting. This did not dry all the way up here. See, that's where that pencil might be making all the erasing, and the pencil lines on the paper make a difference. There was a spot that the paint didn't take. Try to do something with it. Don't want a line there either. Okay, I'll leave it there like that for now. I'll still have to move this around a bit so I don't get my puddles, since this paper is not stretched. Eventually, I'm going to show you how to work on stretch paper. And stretch paper, it's much better. And if you go with a higher quality paper, such as my favorite is Arch. If you go with that, you'll find you'll get better results. But this is good enough for student grade practicing. Okay, and I should have wet this more. This is a big area. I need to wet it with just some clear water. So let's get some clear water going. I'm not only saving space for my branch, but the snow on the branch. Saving some of that. I haven't done that all the way around. So some of it I may just do a razor blade for some of it. A lot of it, I should say. As much as you need. That depends on your drawing. Okay, so I'm trying to consider the value that was over there. So I'm dropping more blue up here. Going darker. Darker there. Just let it continue to run. There we go. Looks pretty good. And I'll drop some salt in it in a few moments. Let me continue. I'll go over here first. This is a small section, so I'm not concerned about putting the water down first. But I will come back and drop more pigment because this is so much darker. Drop a little green in there. The nice thing with that French ultramarine is it granulates beautifully. So it really works in your favor to get that granulation in a scene like this. That's why it was the best choice of blues to use in this piece for a day that's still overcast and snowing. I could have wet that one first. But I'm just in such a hurry, I didn't. Okay, so there we go. Make sure I'm dropping plenty of pigment in there, though. And again, come back and drop the salt in. This is where most of the work is just painting around these, the branches right now. Ooh, ooh la la, look at that. It's pretty, isn't it? Drop more salt in. Now, if I were working on a stretched paper, another thing I could do to create the salt effect is if it was a good quality paper that was stretched, I could also take a spray bottle and mist it, or a toothbrush and flicker just clear water to also create an effect of snow. So we're going to tilt this every once in a while. Let's come up here. Continue working the background behind the tree. Now, when you're doing trees, like I was saying earlier, practice drawing trees. Do sketches of trees. And when you start drawing trees, look at, a lot of times trees are grouped together. So whether it's grouped together even by itself, there's a silhouette to the tree, look for that particular silhouette. And make sure you capture that, because the silhouette itself can say what kind of tree it is. So for example, whoops, like some trees, like an evergreen is going to have a very different obvious look than, say, a deciduous tree that's an oak or a maple or an elm or something different that is more of a deciduous tree. It will have an entirely different silhouette to it. And some trees are more pyramid shaped, some of them are more where they mound at the top. They have different shapes to them. So make sure you capture the shape, because usually that will define the tree in itself. And then some trees, like even with evergreens, you'll have some trees where the branches are going to grow in an upward motion, and then some are going to grow with the branches going downward. So again, it can define what type of a tree that it actually is. Get a little more green in here, a few areas. I don't want to mess with my paper too much, so preferably you want to touch the water and not press onto the paper when you're dropping more pigment. Or eventually I'll show you pouring, a pouring method that's pretty cool too. Will help you keep a nice fresh look with your paint. So now if I want to add, like if I wanted to define some, let's see, let me get more ultramarine and the French ultramarine and the burnt sienna. Let's see, let's put like just a little more definition here. Okay, so here's our background. Make sure these edges are where I want them to be. There. Put a little more green on this side. Yeah, I like that better. There we go. Voila. We'll just let this dry for now, the top part. I really don't want to do too much. I want this to set up a bit more before I go into the background area and soften that edge up a bit more. It's happening. So in the meantime, if you need to mix some more paint, it would be a good time to do that. Make sure you're mixing plenty for the next stage. So we'll actually go in and do the tree part last. And there's going to be drifts on the edges of the tree, and there'll be some drifting on the branches with white snow as well. On this side, it's beginning to set up pretty good. So I want it to, I don't want a hard edge there. I don't need a hard edge. So what I'm going to do, oh, that graphite's coming through. My water-soluble graphite. So I'm going to bring the water down into the foreground area. So I have a soft edge from background to foreground. Let it mix on its own. I'm adding more water to the paint. Since I got a lot of my value from the water-soluble graphite, I don't need much value back there. So I'm going to keep the value super light, but I do want it to blend this middle ground area into the background area. Because it's a small painting and I am going to have there's an awful lot of detail for a small painting in this one. So I'm going to bring this all the way down to here for now. And then we're going to do the other side is still much more wet, but I'm going for it. I probably normally would let it dry to set up just a smidgen longer, but it won't hurt to have a little bit softer edge over here. Okay. Voila, look how pretty that is. And again, I'm going to drop more salt into my painting. So let's get more salt. More salt going on here. There we go. So it's going to continue to create that snow effect. I can even drop a little bit. I'm going to drop a little bit of a darker value into the snow just to get a little more variation in my snow. There's a lot of snow going to be in this scene. Love it. Can you see that pretty good? Okay. So next, as I come forward, I'm going to put more ultramarine blue into my paint mixture with less of the burnt sienna. But remember, when I showed you my swatches, if I don't have some burnt sienna in there, my blue is going to have too much intensity to it, and it's going to look like a sunny day and not a snowing scene. So, and this is where I might want to save just a little bit of some white, possibly in the tree. So let's pull this down here. Look how pretty. Let's wet this. Let's put some straight water down. It's going to blend better. There we go. Look at that baby. Yeah, you might want to clip it first. I didn't put any clips on mine, but if you put clips on your the edge of your paper, it'll help it to not warp so much. Give some more shadow in that snow. And create a little bit of shadow in the snow drifts. This is a good little painting to do for a beginning scene. Okay. And last but not least, the last part, of course, is going to be the tree. But in the meantime, we're going to add some more salt for snow. Let your salt go random, because that's how snow falls. Voila. Look at that baby, setting up beautifully. Now, we need to let this dry before we can do the last stage of the painting. Unless I want branches that are going to blend into my background, which I could potentially do. So, and if need be, like see in this area, I need to soften a few edges where the snow drifts are. So I'm going to take some clear water along the edge there so it blends beautifully on its own. Same thing here. Voila. There we go. Now, to make the tree color, again, your tree is going to be French ultramarine blue. See, I didn't even use any cobalt. No cobalt in this one. But the cobalt blue works great in snow if you have more of a sunny effect. When it's sunny, there's a lot of color in snow. Now, this French ultramarine is a very, very warm blue. And it can start to almost give the effect. Let me take a smaller brush. It can almost look like a grayed violet. Yeah, I don't want it too wet because I don't want to make a mess of what I have going on started over here. Whoops, that's too wet. Too wet. I might need to have that set up just a little bit longer. Yeah, see, because I wanted to start putting my branches in, but see, the paint's expanding too much. It's too wet back there. Now, unless I want to have it just look like it's clustering and blending totally into the background, which is okay in a few areas, but not everywhere. We can do a little bit of that. Now, this is still too wet. Too wet. So let's let that set up a bit before we paint those branches in there. Okie dokie. So that'll be the next and pretty much the last phase of this painting. Okay, so we're about ready to start the last part of this video, and I'll go over a couple of things. So, one, I still have burnt sienna and ultramarine, or burnt sienna and the green mix, the phthalo green. I want to use this in highly concentrated so I get a dark value. And from time to time, I'll just add more ultramarine blue to it. And I've gone in and started putting in a few branches. My paper is taking its time in drying, which in the classroom, it will be much quicker. So what I did was I went into where some of these small branches are, and I've just gone with an extra amount of the French ultramarine with the burnt sienna or straight French ultramarine. And I'm using a very small, I'm not sure what size this is, but you can use, I have in the classroom, there are brushes that you can use for signing or details. You use this brush for doing these tiny little branches in here. And so some of them I put in while it was drying in the background, so the paper was slightly damp. And so I was able to create some extra branches in there. And then that won't make it look overly detailed when it's complete. And it will be much more realistic looking. And you don't have to worry about drawing those branches out quite as perfectly or saving whites. Okay, if I need to pull out some whites later on, I can either just take water on with a clean brush and come into these areas and do some lifting, or I could take an X-Acto knife and go in there and scrape a little bit. And the third way would be to add white paint, which I really don't want to do. Not to say that you can't, but that would be the third option. So let's see. Oh yes, so this brush set, this is a really old brush set, put out by Winsor Newton, and they were series, their top series 7 sable brushes, and that are retractable, but they haven't been around for many years. It must have been a limited edition about 30 odd years ago. But Cotman, who is made by Winsor Newton, puts out a synthetic that's retractable, and it's actually, I like this brush. I've used this brush a lot over the years, and the one thing, the nylon brushes have really improved significantly in the last 30, 40 years. I mean, they're just not even the same. They hold much more water, and they work a little better for watercolor. So unless you're doing something where you need to have your brush to hold a lot of water, then you want to go to a sable brush or a good squirrel brush. But the nylon brushes can work well for some of these small areas where you're doing detail, which you don't have to spend as much money on a brush then. And if you can see, there's some darker areas of blue in here, and then I'm covering, even some of them I'm going to cover up entirely. I haven't got to the big areas because the paper was still pretty damp. So we'll be doing that pretty soon here too. But I'm going to leave a lot of the white in there, or I will go in at the end, and if I say I go, oh, there's just too much white on that branch still, I can come in here later on and add a little bit more blue. And what that'll do is it'll push it farther back in the distance, which gives you a little aerial perspective. And you can see here I put a little bit of ultramarine thinned out. I'll do a little bit more. Whoops, that was too dark. So let's stretch this out over here. You don't want to have too much of the white going like a spider web all over your page paper. It's just not going to be attractive if you have too much of it. Remember, keep your eye within the picture plane. So like the branches at the edges, you may want to go a little darker along the edges, and not have as much white on the branches there. And you can just tone it down with a little bit of blue thinned way down, is all you need. There, like that, right there. See, I just thin that paint down there and put it down, and it looks better to have, you don't want to have too much white, okay? So, also the other thing I want to say is, we'll find out when we get done with the trunk, but this area here, I don't have a lot of contrast between the snowdrift and the middle ground area. So there may need to be one of the two. I usually would go darker in the snowdrift on the tree rather than the space behind, but we'll play that by ear as we go along. You want to keep your options open there, okay? So where do we want to tackle this next? You know what? I'm going to stick to my tiny brush still. Stick to the small brush, and we're going to just continue to add a little bit more of a thin blue shadow in the snow here. So that would be the branch that goes behind there. Let's tone that down a little bit. That'll look better. Very nice. I like the way the direction we're going in. I hope you can see this without my arm being in the way. I'm still getting used to this new stand here. Okay. There, a little bit of blue. And there's going to be places where the trunk will start to get real dark, dark, dark. But we're not quite there yet. I'll just take a little bit of water to thin that out. If this had a chance to completely dry, I would come in here and do a little more erasing of some of the pencil lines. There. Like I said, not too much white. I want to make sure those branches look, keeping it as simple as possible, but yet that they still have form, that you're building form in the branches. Okay. Now, what I believe I want to do is I'm going to show a little bit of texture here. There's snow. I'm going to leave some snow, but also have some texture in the bark. Switch brushes now. Let's work the other side of the branch, or trunk, I should say. A little more dark in there, dropping more pigment. You have to evaluate that as you're working. I've done a similar scene to this a couple of times for a demonstration. And I usually start, if I remember correctly, I haven't done it in a long time, but I think I've usually started at the bottom of the tree. Usually I'd have that trunk super, super dark. But I want to get a little texture going in the bark. Sometimes I'll drop a little blue into the brownish gray color. And when I do, it's because I want to change the temperature. So even though it's an overcast sky, the snow still reflects what little bit of light that there is. And so the temperatures are going to change as, as you have the form turns. color up in here. Now, we're going to drop more blue in this area, for example, because of the way the form and the snow would be turning there. If you have a cast shadow, you're going to drop the blue. So, since there'll be snowdrift sitting on top of that branch there, we're going to stick some blue right smack underneath it. Blue also helps it to go darker in value. So every once in a while, I'm putting some vertical lines in the bark for texture. Clear water. You know, at times you want to work into the wet paint, and other times you want it to dry in between. So, like these little branches, I was able, it had a slight dampness when I went in there and started to put the ones in the damp paper in the background so that they just bleed right into it and you don't get a hard line. In the one where there is a little bit more hard line, I wanted a hard line, again, adding more depth. So consider that. And then this area here, I don't want to have as much blending. So you're going to work more on a dry surface. Okay. Funny, I've done a demonstration with the snow scene in several different classes I've taught, and every time it has such a different look to it. You don't want it to look the same every time. You want it to have that different look, right? That it doesn't look like it's cookie cutter done. Well, this is wet. I'll drop more blue, and that will help the whole thing look like it's turning, that there's more form. When I finish doing the branches in the trunk area, I can let the whole thing dry and come back if I want to and add a little more texture using what's called a dry brush technique, which a dry brush is where your paper, you can go over another color and you're going to take, your brush is barely damp. I'll do it with a blue here. Let's see if this is, it's almost too wet. And you're use kind of the side of your brush more, and you can create textures this way. Did you see that? So I would be using more the side of the brush, barely damp. The paint is barely damp. In fact, sometimes it's just flat out straight out of the tube, and you're just going to brush it like that. That's a dry brush technique. It's getting pretty dark there, so I don't think I want to go any darker than that. I usually do a dark trunk, but I like this lighter trunk. A lot more snow. See, I'm darkening up the edges here so I don't have too much white leading the eye outside the picture plane here. And honestly, I've done some pretty, I'm not doing any sophisticated technique here. It's really kind of simple the way I'm laying it in. But coming back with a cool temperature will help for it to have a little bit more form. By dropping some blue, creating shadow and temperature change. Okay. Now let's see how we're going to handle this up here. There we go. Clean your brushes well afterwards because there's still salt on the paper and you don't want to have that get into your, stay on your brushes. Don't let them look like lines either though. Okay, when this dries, I'll soften that line right there. And like I said, I would have probably gone in and already erased where there's pencil line in here. Because there's so much pencil, it's intruding upon my areas that I want to stay white. And it's kind of taking away the how much white is actually left there. It's hard to tell. Cutting down on a little bit of that white. Yeah, I don't like, this is too much over here. We're going to cut down on some of this. Shadow underneath. I can come in here if I want and maybe do a little scraping later. I want to turn my paper, but I know you won't be able to see what I'm doing if I do, so I'll have to work with it. I might have to move instead of my paper. Whoops, too dark. There we go, better, much better. Okay, let's come over here. Let's just leave that side as is there. Okay, sorry about this. I hope my arm is not in the way. This branch needs some more work still. First, let's do the branch in front first. Yeah, we better finish this trunk up here. Let's start with the bottom portion. Okay, so there's a foreshortening in the branch here. So I'm going to stick some blue where that foreshortening is. Where that foreshortening is. And for those that may not be familiar with the term foreshortening is a drawing term that applies to a type of perspective where if you have something either like coming straight at you or moving straight up and down, and there's this extreme it can be an extreme sort of coming straight at you or away or up and down. angle, you get what's called a foreshortening, which things get exaggerated. So the part that comes closer to you will appear much larger than if it is normally, say, at its side. So like, for example, if you put your hand next to your face, it's about the size of your face. And if you put your hand straight in front of you like this, and someone looks at you, your hand will now appear much larger than your face. That's foreshortening. I'm going to put a little more blue up here. There's a snowdrift there. There's some pretty heavy snowdrifts. Kind of like the weather we've had lately. Careful, that's not too dark. I don't want it to just completely blend into the background either. It will dry lighter, yes. Keep the snow pretty much just white. Remember, this is a small piece. Let's add a little more blue temperature and contrast here. The other thing is that as something is closer to you, you'll have more contrast, value contrast. So my branches on the tree, there can be more contrast on that tree, value contrast. Let's just bring this all the way down here. There we go. Okay, you know, this is such a small piece, I really don't need to do a whole lot to it. Less can be more. I think I'll let that dry. The branches. What I think I will do is I'm going to come in here and I'm just going to add a little more value contrast definition here. Not a whole lot. Look at that. Just that little tiny bit was enough to... Or usually I'm adding it more in the foreground. So I've taken a real different route than my inspiration pictures that I've done from previous demonstrations in other classes. I used to teach the watercolor 1 and 2 class pretty regularly at the college, but I hadn't taught it for a long while. I wanted to take a kind of redesign and revamp the whole class. And this is definitely a revamp from the way I used to teach it. And several of you had that class more than once, and you can attest to that. Okay. As I said, I don't want to do too much detail. So at this point, I think the best thing is let it dry. I can decide if I want to put any more dry brush in. I would like to erase my pencil marks and get rid of some of those pencil lines. Then I will probably come in. I need to soften a few edges here and there, like say this one. I could do that right now. Let's do that now. Let's soften this edge up just a little bit because the underneath side of the snow. So I'm just putting water on the brush to soften it up and blending where that harder edge was with the snow area above it. Okay. A little bit more of the blue here too. I don't want brown, because you don't want brown in your snow. You want blue in your snow. The other thing I can do is, so I let this dry. Then a couple things I can do is, if I want to erase pencil lines, get rid of the pencil lines, because it may be that I might have to touch up my branches. Oh, in fact, I'm gonna take a wild guess and say I definitely need to do that up here. This branch looks a little thick. I don't know if I intended originally perhaps to have made more than one branch up there, it looks like, because it's a little thick. So let's put a little bit more blue in there. Tone that down. Soften this edge. Same like thing I did down here. I'm just taking clear water, no paint. Put some of that down. So I can touch it up later. Go ahead and sign it with paint using a small brush. I'd wipe the salt off, clean up the pencil lines. Do I need any dry brush? And if so, that would be the time to do it. And I would do the dry brush after I erase the pencil line. So if there's any part of my branches that need a little bit of work or a little more shadowing, I would do it at that moment. So I can see where even this drift up here that is a little bigger, let's drop a little more blue in it even now, just because we know there's snow there. We want to really, that's not all branch, part of that is snow, is what we're trying to say. Okie dokie. It's a little bit more shadow there underneath the snowdrift. I'm going to leave it as is for now. Let's go ahead and sign it. You can actually, if you want, you can sign with pencil first, but don't sign with markers, because markers are more apt to fade when you go to sign your name. When I first started working as an artist, I signed my work Lorraine Brady, then it was Lorraine Brady Hall, and then I was remarried and it became Lorraine Brady Arthur. So for younger women, I recommend just sticking with your maiden name. Plus, I don't hyphenate my maiden name and my married name. But it makes for a very, very long name. And if I were to have started for all over again from scratch, I'd probably just do L. Brady and just stuck with that. I know some female artists don't want to show that they're a female. So, because for a long time, male artists got more money than female artists did for their paintings. So, but let's go ahead and sign this. Now, when I sign a painting, I want to take color that I've already used in the painting. You don't want your name to stand out too much. It just looks tacky. The traditional place to sign would be down here in the left bottom corner. So I'll put my whole name on there. How about that? My whole long name. Yeah. And in this modern day we live in, if you have a website, if you have LorraineBradyArthur.com, it gets pretty long and maybe even a little harder for people to remember. On the other hand, you know, if your name's John Smith, there's probably a gazillion John Smiths in the world. So I'm just using French ultramarine. And I'm going to print it on here. We used a limited palette. We were going to stick to our blues, blue-green greens. Voila. I hope you have fun painting this painting.